Beneath the worn mountains of Appalachia, there are stories that never made it into textbooks, stories whispered in hollow valleys, carried through the trees like a warning, stories of families that locked their doors not just to keep the world out, but to keep their secrets in. Tonight, we're going to step into the most disturbing of them all, a bloodline so twisted by inbreeding that their very existence became a haunting reminder of what isolation, secrecy, and silence can do to the human spirit. This is not folklore. This is not rumor. This is the most inbred bloodline in Appalachian history, and once you know their story, you'll never look at those mountains the same way again. The people of Appalachia are no strangers to struggle. From coal towns carved into stone to cabins rotting into the hillsides, hardship was a part of life. But survival in these mountains often demanded more than hard work. It demanded sacrifice. Families grew protective, insular, outsiders weren't welcomed easily, and bloodlines intertwined like the roots of old oak trees. In some hollows, entire generations never saw beyond a ridge, never married beyond their own kin. And in one hidden branch of this rugged history, that insularity grew into something grotesque. What makes this family story so haunting isn't only the deformities that emerged, or the whispers that spread from town to town. It's the way silence protected them, how neighbors knew but looked the other way, how children were born into a cycle they never chose, only to inherit the weight of choices made long before their time. Faces marked by inbreeding, minds shaped by both cruelty and ignorance. And yet, within this darkness, fragments of innocence remained. Children who only knew the world they were given, who couldn't comprehend the horror etched into their blood. For generations, this family's existence was hidden, in plain sight. Poverty kept them tucked away in crumbling shacks, fear kept outsiders at a distance, and shame kept their story out of public memory, until, piece by piece, details began to emerge. A photo here, a court record there, fragments that historians now piece together like bones from an unmarked grave. But before we explore those fragments, I want you to remember something. The Appalachian Mountains don't just hold beauty, they hold secrets, and this is one of the darkest of them all. The story begins in an isolated hollow, a place so deep in the mountains that it may as well have been a world of its own. Dirt paths twisted into the woods, cabins sagged under decades of neglect, and the sound of rushing creeks drowned out any noise of the outside world. To live there was to be forgotten, to be born there was to inherit a life already decided. Generations ago, when poverty clung to the land like smoke, families in this region clung to one another. But what began as survival soon turned into something else. Cousins married cousins. Brothers and sisters whispered vows in the dark. Mothers gave birth to children whose fathers were never spoken of aloud. And over time, the blood thickened. The family tree no longer branched. It coiled in on itself. The children bore the marks of it. Crossed eyes, slurred speech, limbs that didn't grow as they should. Some could barely communicate, their words tangled and broken. Others lived with minds clouded, unable to understand why they were different. Yet, within their family, this was normal. There was no shame among themselves, because there was no comparison. They were born into a cage without walls, never shown another way of life. Outsiders who stumbled into their world spoke of encounters that chilled them to the bone. Strangers described eerie, wordless stares from figures lurking in the shadows of collapsing porches. Some recalled guttural noises that didn't sound human, drifting across the hollows like cries carried by the wind. One visitor wrote of a child crawling on all fours, barking like a dog at his approach. The line between human and something else blurred, and the whispers began. But whispers are dangerous in places like these. To speak too loudly was to risk drawing attention, and attention could bring humiliation, exploitation, or worse. So neighbors kept their distance. They avoided the family's property, told their children not to wander too close, and let the bloodline fester in silence, a silence that lasted decades. It's here, in this silence, that the horror deepened. because what outsiders saw as grotesque inside the family was simply life. New children were born, repeating the same patterns, carrying the same features, trapped in a cycle as old as the cabin walls that enclosed them. And as years passed, their existence became less like a family, and more like a secret that the mountains themselves refused to give up. By the early 20th century, the family's hollow had become more myth than place. Locals whispered of it, but few dared to set foot there. Those who did rarely spoke of what they saw, as though the memory itself carried a curse. And yet, the truth left traces. Photographs taken in dim light, records buried in courthouses, testimonies from social workers who stumbled into something they could barely comprehend. The photographs are the most haunting. Grainy, black and white. They show faces that seem caught between human familiarity and something distorted, something unsettling. Eyes that wander in different directions, jaws misaligned, foreheads that jutted unnaturally. The kind of faces that could never blend into a crowd, faces that bore the evidence of a secret the family had never chosen, but one they could not escape. What makes these images unbearable to look at isn't only the deformities, it's the expressions, children gazing into the lens with the innocence of not knowing how the world would see them, adults staring with a vacant detachment, as if already resigned to the lives they had been born into. Behind every photograph lies the silence of generations, a silence that screams louder than words ever could. Local officials, when they were forced to intervene, often wrote about the family with words that stripped them of humanity. They were reduced to curiosities, specimens of what happens when blood turns in on itself, but the deeper truth was far more tragic. These weren't monsters. They weren't demons. They were people, trapped in a cycle designed by isolation, poverty, and shame. And perhaps that is the darkest part of all, that they had no power to change the story written into their very bodies. Neighbors knew the truth, though few spoke it aloud. Children in nearby towns dared one another to walk past the hollow at night. Farmers whispered about eerie noises, inhuman cries echoing through the trees, and in every telling, the story twisted further, until fact and legend fused into something terrifying. Yet beneath the fear and exaggeration, there remained a raw, undeniable reality. This family existed, and they bore the weight of choices made generations before them. When the Depression came, and the nation's eye briefly turned to Appalachia, reports of the family spread further. Social workers, photographers, even journalists began to circle the hollow, and with their arrival, the veil that had protected the family for decades began to tear. What had been hidden in whispers and shadows was about to be dragged into the light. The first outsiders who truly documented the family did so with a mix of fascination and horror. They arrived under the guise of charity, social workers hoping to address poverty, journalists eager to capture the forgotten corners of America, photographers searching for images that could shock the nation into pity. But what they found in that hollow was not simply poverty, it was something that unsettled them in ways they struggled to describe. One report described entering a shack that reeked of damp wood and unwashed bodies. The children, barefoot and thin, moved strangely, some crawling instead of walking, some grunting in place of speech. A girl with crossed eyes stared silently from the corner, clutching a broken doll. An older man muttered words no one could understand, his jaw slack, his movements twitching like a marionette with its strings cut. To the outsiders, it was like stepping into another world, one that felt older, darker, and untouched by the progress of the nation beyond the hills. Yet instead of compassion, what came next was something more exploitative. Photographs were taken without consent. Articles were written that painted the family as grotesque oddities rather than human beings. They became an object of morbid curiosity, a symbol of everything wrong with mountain life. To the wider world, they weren't seen as victims of circumstance. They were paraded as freaks of nature, an Appalachian shame to be hidden or mocked. For the family, little changed. They remained in their hollow, sheltered only by poverty and the distance of the ridges. But the intrusion left scars. Children grew fearful of strangers. Adults became more withdrawn, watching the tree line for uninvited guests. The silence that had once been chosen for survival now became enforced by fear of exposure. This was the paradox of their existence. To the outside world, they were a spectacle. To themselves, they were simply surviving as best they could with the blood they had been given. They didn't ask to be born into this web of repetition, but they bore it all the same, generation after generation. And in the cruelty of the public gaze, their humanity was erased. They became a story, a warning, a whispered legend told to children at night. But the truth was darker than legend, because legends distance us from reality. And in this case, the reality was far more tragic. A family broken not by choice, but by isolation so complete that it swallowed them whole. And as the 20th century pressed forward, their bloodline continued, quietly repeating the same story the mountains had been keeping for over a century. By the middle of the 20th century, the family had become a living ghost story. Children in nearby towns whispered dares to sneak near their hollow, while adults muttered warnings at the mere mention of their name. The legend grew teeth, but beneath it all, the family still lived in silence, continuing the cycle no one dared break. Researchers began to circle again, this time not only journalists but academics, anthropologists, psychologists, people who wanted to study what they saw as a human anomaly. They spoke clinically about genetic deformities, speech impediments, cognitive decline. Charts and notes were made, reducing flesh and blood into statistics. But behind every clinical description was a life, someone who laughed, cried, hungered, or longed for comfort, even if the world refused to see them as anything more than specimens. This is where the story begins to gnaw at the conscience, because if these were monsters, there would be no tragedy. But they weren't. They were human beings, born into a nightmare with no escape. Children didn't choose their parents, they didn't choose their blood. Yet each newborn carried the weight of choices made long before, born already marked by the history of their family. And in those mountains, there was no doctor to intervene, no school that could truly help them, no church brave enough to face the shame. They were left to the woods, to each other, to silence. Some who visited spoke of seeing tenderness within the family, a brother protecting his sister from ridicule, a mother humming softly to a child whose eyes would never align, small human gestures almost unbearable in their innocence because they revealed what outsiders preferred to ignore, that this was still a family, not demons, not creatures, a family. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because most turn away, unable to stomach the idea that such lives existed so close to our own history. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, hidden in the hollow? Or would you have tried to run, carrying the shame of your own name into the outside world? The mountains kept them hidden for over a century, but as America modernized, the walls of silence began to crack. And what spilled out was not only a story of deformity and horror, but of how an entire community allowed this family to vanish into isolation while pretending not to see. By the 1970s, the outside world had begun to close in on even the most forgotten corners of Appalachia. Roads cut deeper into the mountains, outsiders moved closer, and government officials could no longer ignore families that had once been left to their own devices. And so the bloodline that had lived for generations in silence suddenly found itself under a spotlight it had never asked for. The encounters that followed were haunting. Officials and researchers documented children who could barely speak, adults who communicated in grunts and gestures, families who looked at visitors as though they had arrived from another planet. But what unsettled the outsiders most wasn't the deformities, it was the sense of timelessness. It was as if the family had been living in a loop, untouched by progress, each generation repeating the one before it like an endless echo. In interviews, neighbors admitted they had always known. Some had even provided scraps of food, old clothes, or work when desperation was too great to ignore. But they never intervened beyond that. Fear, shame, and superstition built invisible walls around the family. People told themselves it was better not to get involved, that those people were different, that their world should be left alone. And so the cycle endured, not because no one saw, but because everyone looked away. As modern America expanded around them, the family's hollow became a living relic. Children who should have gone to school were left behind. Adults who might have found work elsewhere remained in the shadows, unable or unwilling to step into a world that had long since left them behind. The bloodline shrank, not because it chose to end, but because it could no longer sustain itself against the pressures of the outside world. But the cruelest truth is this: even as the family's numbers dwindled, the shame remained. For those who carry the name, escape was nearly impossible. Imagine leaving the hollow only to have every glance remind you of where you came from. Imagine trying to start a new life while knowing that your very face told the story you were desperate to escape. That was the inheritance passed down, not just blood, but stigma, one that clung tighter than any chain. The mountains, once their protector, had become their prison, and as their story leaked further into public knowledge, they were no longer just hidden. They were exposed, dissected, turned into a grotesque curiosity for a world eager to stare but unwilling to understand. And so we arrive at the present, where the bloodline exists less as a family and more as a memory carved into the mountains. Their story has become a twisted piece of Appalachian folklore, told in whispers, exploited in articles, and passed along in photographs that still circulate today. Yet behind every haunting image, behind every cruel joke or sensational headline, lies a truth far darker and far more human than legend allows. The most inbred bloodline in Appalachian history was not a curse born from wickedness. It was born from poverty, from isolation, from a silence so heavy that it smothered every chance of escape. These people were not monsters. They were victims of a cycle that no one had the courage to break. Victims of neglect disguised as indifference, of neighbors who saw but pretended not to see, of a society that preferred to turn away from what disturbed it most. Their legacy is not only genetic, it is psychological. Children grew up knowing no other life, their innocence trapped in bodies marked by history. Adults carried the weight of shame without ever having the words to name it, and those who tried to leave found themselves pursued not by family, but by stigma, the burden of a name that could never be cleansed. The hollow may have been their prison, but it was also their only refuge. Beyond it, the world was even crueler. When we look at their story now, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What happens when human beings are abandoned by the very society meant to protect them? How much suffering can be created not by malice, but by silence? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how many more stories like this remain buried in the forgotten folds of history, hidden just far enough away that we can pretend they never existed? The mountains hold many secrets, but few as haunting as this one. A family line that twisted inward until it could twist no more. A bloodline that became a legend, a cautionary tale, and a mirror held up to the darker corners of human neglect. Their story is not just Appalachia's story, it is America's story. A reminder that sometimes the most horrifying truths are not those we invent, but those we refuse to face. And so, when you walk through the Appalachian woods and you feel the silence pressing down like a weight, remember this: silence is not empty. Silence remembers. And in those shadows, the echoes of the most inbred bloodline in Appalachian history still linger.